and excited to talk today to Aaron Maté. He is a journalist. He is an investigative journalist. He's a contributor to The Nation. He's written a lot about the Steele Dossier and Russiagate. And he's also the host of Pushback with Aaron Maté. Aaron Maté, welcome to the news.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
It is great to talk with you. So I definitely want to delve into this Steele Dossier story, which it seems to have now really been, I don't know if the word debunked is the right word, but it looks pretty embarrassing. Why don't you just tell us your take on it as of now?
Sure. Let me just correct my bio in case my employers get mad at me. So I work for the Gray Zone, which is a news outlet. And I also write regularly now for Real Clear Investigation. The Nation magazine is where I did the bulk of my Russiagate work during the heart of Russiagate, but I don't contribute there as much. So the Steele Dossier was presented to us as this work of master sleuthing by former British spy Christopher Steele. And when it was released in January 2017, it sort of really escalated the already growing Trump-Russia frenzy. But this was a explosive document claiming that Russia had compromised on Trump, sexual blackmail. We all know about the P-tape. That there was a long-standing conspiracy between Trump and Russia, where Russia would give him, intelligence on his political rivals, and had all these other insane claims like Michael Cohen going to Prague to pay off Russian hackers who had interfered on behalf of Trump. And we later learned that this played a major role in the Trump-Russia investigation. The FBI used the Steele Dossier to get surveillance warrants on Carter Page when it told the court that there was suspicion of a conspiracy between Trump and Russia. The main source was the Steele Dossier. And the FBI also used the Steele Dossier for investigative leads. They had a spreadsheet basically trying to chase down every single explosive claim that Steele had made. And of course, they couldn't because it turns out to be fiction. And what's interesting is that the FBI knew this was fiction early on. In January 2017, they interviewed the Steele Dossier's main source, a guy named Igor Danchenko. And far from having access to any high-level sources as the Steele Dossier suggested he did, Danchenko was actually a DC-based Russian expat who had better access to the Beltway. He was a fellow at the Brookings Institution. And he told the FBI early on that his sources, whose claims went into the dossier, were not high-level Kremlin people. They're basically people that he knew, his friends of his, who he had beers with, and they engaged in hearsay. And that's why he told the FBI that corroboration for his claims was, quote, zero. But the FBI strangely hid all this from the U.S. public. They still continue to go to the FISA courts and seek surveillance warrants on Carter Page using the Steele Dossier. And they let this Trump-Russia innuendo in this investigation continue for several more years. And since then, of course, it's all collapsed. I mean, first came the major revelation in October 2017 that far from Steele being this concerned citizen who happened to have come across a massive Trump-Russia conspiracy, actually he was being paid by the Clinton campaign. A small little detail. That came out in October 2017.
Not good.
Yeah.
Not good. Let me ask you, so let's put a pin in it, but I want you to complete all that.
Sure.
But let me ask you, so Steele was billed by, I remember like David Korn, at Mother Jones, sort of said what a great spy he is. NBC had a story that he's like a real life James Bond. Was Steele ever a legit like spy, or because if he lived up to his billing, he would not have made these mistakes, I assume.
Well, it's funny. That was the narrative that Steele had given the FBI all this credible information in previous investigations, and that's why they could trust him. I honestly think that his British accent was really the only thing that convinced people that he was credible. He's a white guy, and he looks kind of like, he looks kind of regal, I guess. He has a British accent. And honestly, I think that was the only thing that really they had to convince themselves that he was credible. Because you look at his actual record, the in late 2019, Michael Horowitz, the Justice Department Inspector General, did a report that just destroyed the Steele dossier. And one of the things he points out is that while Steele and his defenders claim that he gave the FBI all this important information for previous investigations, like an investigation into corruption in FIFA, he actually didn't. And Barry Meyer, who is a veteran Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, just came out with a book called Spooked that does a lot of reporting on the Steele dossier. And he also says he couldn't find any evidence that Steele had previously passed off anything useful to the FBI. So look, this whole thing was just a scam. It was fiction. It was a piece of fiction, and then a fiction created about the fiction to make it look credible. And amazingly, you go back and even after Danchenko told the FBI that the dossier was basically a joke, you still have anonymous intelligence officials feeding false claims to the New Yorker, to CNN, to elsewhere, that they're looking into the dossier and that it's checking out. So there was obviously a group of people in the intelligence community, for whatever reason, really wanted to make Steele look credible and really wanted to fuel the narrative that he had helped create, which is that there was a conspiracy between Trump and Russia.
Wow. I was just sorry to interrupt, but I've always been curious about that Steele part, because he was, we were told that he was this highly respected, intelligence operator. And we've heard that before about a lot of other people, though, and it doesn't pan out usually.
Again, what I can confirm about Steele is that he has a British accent. That's confirmed. He has a British accent, so he sounds like,
Oh yeah, trust me. You don't have to convince me of the power of a British accent. Like I'm a big believer that it will take you a long way. Like I could wonder how far I might go if I had a British accent.
There you go. Exactly.
But I interrupted you. Keep going with the story.
Okay, so the first major blow to the Steele dossier is credibility. I mean, look, the first major blow to the Steele dossier's credibility is when it gets published in January 2017, because you read it and it's a joke. Okay, it's so ridiculous. And by the way, even before we found out that the Clinton campaign was paying for it, even if you were to put aside how ridiculous the Steele dossier sounds, the P-tape, like Russia is cultivating Trump back when he's hosting The Apprentice, like as this potential figure to like destroy the world and install in the White House, it's all a joke. But look, there was such an obvious pattern that should have been evident to anyone just reading the dossier chronologically, because the dossier was written, in various stages. The first item comes in June, then in July. And basically, Steele's defenders like Rachel Maddow, they would look to the contents of the Steele dossier and they would say, look, a lot of what he said turned out to be publicly confirmed. And what they missed in saying that, though, is that, yes, that's because Steele would write something after some approximate predication had already came out publicly. So, for example, Steele doesn't mention that Russia is accused of stealing the Democratic Party emails until after Russia gets publicly accused of stealing the Democratic Party emails. And by the way, gets accused by another Clinton campaign contractor called CrowdStrike, which is another interesting story. Steele, all of a sudden in August, I guess, writes that Trump and Russia have made a quid pro quo of Russia is going to help the Trump campaign. In return, Trump is going to water down a plank in the Republican National Convention platform.
Yeah, Ukraine.
And guess what? That only comes out because Josh Rogan recently writes a column in the Washington Post about this platform change. Now, Rogan got it wrong. First of all, these platforms are completely meaningless, as we all know. I mean, it doesn't matter what goes into a platform. So the idea that Russia and Trump would make a quid pro quo over a platform language is ridiculous on its face. But of course, what actually happened was basically somebody wanted to propose some strong language about we want to send arms directly to Ukraine, and someone else said we want to change. We want to make that a bit more ambiguous because we don't want to advocate maybe a third world war. Which, by the way, was the exact same position of Barack Obama at the time, who also did not want to send those weapons to Ukraine, and he got attacked for that by a lot of neocons in Washington. Ironically, that would become the basis for Trump's impeachment several years later. But basically, according to Steele, that's not the basis for a quid pro quo. Carter Page going to Moscow. Steele claims that Carter Page was offered a 19% stake in Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, if he can lift U.S. sanctions on Russia. So Carter Page, this Trump campaign volunteer, would have stood to make billions of dollars, become a billionaire overnight if he could lift sanctions on Russia. And that only comes after Carter Page is reported in the media, goes to Moscow. And what was obvious, and I wrote about this early on, was basically Steele and his sources were very good at reading the newspaper and then using their imaginations. That was the extent of their quote-unquote tradecraft. And lo and behold, in this new indictment of Danchenko, that's exactly what one of Steele's sub-sources admitted to. Charles Dolan, who was one of the people who Danchenko spoke to for his claims, he said that when it comes to a claim that he contributed about Paul Manafort, he read about Paul Manafort being fired in the news media and made up a claim based on that. So, which should have been obvious from the start. But instead, the fact that Steele was able to make up a claim based on publicly available information was proof to people like Rachel Maddow of his genius sleuthing powers.
It was. I will say, look, for me, I never cared that much about the Steele dossier, partly because it came out after Trump was elected. And I know that there were a lot of people on the left, not on the left, well, on the left, but a lot of Democrats and never Trumpers who probably wanted to like overturn the election. But to me, the time to stop Trump was before he got elected. And there were a lot of sketchy things that Trump did and said, including like the email. There was like this sports agent or something who emailed Don Jr. and was like, hey, I've got some info from Russia. And Don Jr.'s like, if what you say is true, I'm paraphrasing here, but like that ended up being that Trump Tower meeting, which like nothing came out of it, but it clearly demonstrated to me that Don Jr. was open to the idea of taking information from Russia to use against Hillary. Like, to me, that was a pretty damning thing that has nothing really to do with the Steele dossier.
Yeah, or the underlying claim that there was a Trump-Russia conspiracy. Because, look, I mean, if you want to criticize Don Jr. for that, that's fine. But I mean, personally, I think what the Clintons did, which is paying for a piece of opposition research to smear their opponent, try to push it into the media and the FBI, was a lot more damaging and a lot more cynical. But regardless, look.
So hang on a second. So you think that so you think the Clintons, so I just want to walk through in my own mind. It sounds like you think, so the Clintons hire an oppo firm to dig up dirt on Trump, but not just here domestically, to dig up dirt from him internationally, including from Russia. Do you think that they then knew that it was bogus, but tried to push that intel into the media, even after the election was over?
Well, it's hard to go inside someone's minds because I don't know what they told themselves and believed themselves. It's very easy to convince yourself of anything, especially if you're trying to win a political race, right? You can do anything you can justify anything to yourself. I mean, that's politics, right? But it was very cynical. What we know is that their money paid for Christopher Steele, and Christopher Steele produced the Steele dossier, and then Clinton operatives like Glenn Simpson, Fusion GPS, and other people in the Clinton campaign worked hard to push their farcical claims. Like it recently came out where Michael Sussman, a Clinton campaign lawyer, was indicted for lying to the FBI. Well, he was involved in a scheme before the election to push this claim that there was a secret covert communications channel between the Trump campaign and Russia's Alpha Bank. And they used journalists to get that out there. And it was very cynical. So that to me is a lot worse than Don Jr. taking a meeting with someone who's telling him he has dirt on Hillary Clinton. And look,
I don't know.
It's instead of taking a meeting where you might get dirt, here you are paying for and disseminating the dirt. And you're trying not just to like put it in the media, but you're trying to plant it in the FBI to get them to investigate your opponent. I mean, that's a real.
It is an interesting. I will concede this. Like, it is an interesting debate, and I think a lot of us who have been like very critical of Trump haven't gone through like the intellectual exercise of like, what about what Hillary did, right? Like, I definitely concede that part of it.
Look, this is the problem. I get it. Trump is a loathsome character from what I can tell of him. Okay. I did not want him to win. I was happy when he lost. I get it. But the thing is, we have to separate our feelings about people from the facts. I mean, the facts don't care about our feelings. And ironically, by the way, I mean, look, I thought all this was a huge gift to Trump. Because first of all, if you're, like the regular Fox News viewer, the stereotype of the Fox News viewer, right, is that like there's a deep state plot to like undermine our democracy, and there's always a conspiracy out to get the conservatives, right? In this case, it was right. In this case, there was really a conspiracy to subvert the vote and to falsely portray their hero, Trump, as this Russian agent. He was able to use that to say, look at the swamp coming after me. And it was a good excuse for him, by the way, to not drain the swamp as he promised, because of course he was never going to drain the swamp. That was a con. He expanded the swamp with his billionaire cabinet. But things like Russiagate, he could use that to deflect any responsibility. He could blame his opponents for like bogging him down, and there was a certain truth to that. There was. Now, of course, I don't think he ever intended to really drain the swamp or to like end our foreign wars, as he talked about on the campaign trail. I think he was a very good con man. But Russiagate gave him the gift of like, really there was a conspiracy against him, and also it turned the resistance to him into a bunch of conspiracy theory maniacs, where instead of looking at his actual policies, coming up with alternatives, organizing around it, like Trump's opposition meant being glued to MSNBC and CNN and waiting for Robert Mueller to deliver the smoking gun of collusion. Like, what bigger gift to Trump could there be? And then, of course, when it all collapsed, they gave him the gift of being vindicated, and it was a huge gift to him. I mean, among many other.
You know what's interesting though about this is one big lesson I've learned in life in the last 20 years is people can look really guilty and not be guilty. Remember, so we find out that Gary Condit is banging Chandra Levy, and Chandra Levy disappears, and everyone assumes that he's guilty, right? Because he looks freaking guilty. How about Saddam Hussein with the weapons of mass destruction? Well, it turns out he doesn't want Iran to know that he doesn't have them, but he acts and looks and says he seems guilty. And likewise, Trump really, his behavior as it pertained to Russia really was sketchy and weird. The things he said, like for a politician to be like so pro-Russia, he said to them, he said like on TV, like, hey, if you've got the emails, there were a lot of very weird, sketchy things Trump said that I think would entice someone to believe that like other more crazy things are true about him.
I know a lot of people think that. It doesn't. I mean, that's because I guess I have a different outlook on the world. It wasn't sketchy to me. And actually what I thought was the problem was that, animus towards Russia is so entrenched in this society. They were the Cold War enemy for a long time. And it's especially escalated in the last decade or so as Russia has gotten more, I think, as tensions between the U.S. and Russia have increased over things like Ukraine and Syria, that because Trump was coming along and talking about cooperating with Russia, that people who are steeped in national security state orthodoxy couldn't understand it and saw it as evidence of possible treason. And really, I mean, I think actually, I don't agree with almost anything Trump says, but when he talked about whether we should cooperate with Russia, and when he criticized, foreign wars like Libya and Syria, I thought that made a lot of sense. That was one of the few sensible things he said. But ironically, that's what then attracted the most antagonism from the national security state. The media is when I think he would actually say something that was resembling some common sense. But look, back to the Don Jr. thing, it's, if you want to say that was wrong for him to take that meeting and that was shady, corrupt, whatever, fine. But the point is, what we're concerned with overall is whether there is a conspiracy between Trump and Russia during the election. And that meeting was held up as the number one smoking gun when it first came out. But if you look at the details, as you said, nothing came from it. And really, this Russian offer that Don Jr. accepted didn't come from Russia. It came from a music publicist named Rob Goldstone, who worked for the Trumps on some pageants or something and has worked in the music industry field. He's not Russian. And he made up some claims. He said that this was coming on behalf of the Russian crown prosecutor, which is a position that doesn't even exist. And basically, as Goldstone tirelessly explained, although nobody would listen to him because it was inconvenient to the narrative, he made stuff up about Russia because he wanted to secure a meeting for his friends.
All I'm saying is that and from my standpoint, I think it's very clear that Don Jr. believed that there may be information that would have damaged Hillary Clinton that was coming from Russia, and he was more than happy to take a meeting and see what it was. And to me, that's a no-go zone.
I got it, and fair enough. But it's like if we're gonna apply standards equally, Don Jr. took a meeting. The Clinton campaign took a lot of money and paid for Oppo research that they planted into the media and the FBI. And by the way, Bill Clinton took $500,000 to give a speech once at a Russian bank. And again, I'm personally fine with that. I think that's normal. But if we accept the standard that was applied to Russiagate, that it's like nefarious to talk to Russians, to engage with Russians, to take dirt from Russians, then what the Clinton campaign did was far worse.
Well, it does. I mean, it also raises a question like, okay, during the Cold War, and there were occasions, I think, where like Ted Kennedy might have been working back channels to get intel on Reagan or something. I seem to recall that. We can Google it. But that would have been clearly treason to do something like that. But now in our more global, global world order or whatever, is Russia an enemy of America today? I think, Mitt Romney said they were, like, they're a number one adversary, but like things are blurry. And I think, look at all of the American corporations who are doing business with China right now. And I think China's much more dangerous than Russia to America. So like, what are the rules and what are you allowed to, like, obviously you can't take foreign money, but does Intel, constitute money? Like that was a big question Mueller wrestled with as well. So anyway, I'm filibustering, but what say you?
First of all, I mean, I think America is a danger to everybody else, and I think that's the danger I'm concerned about. But that's a political question. But look, if we care about foreign interference, there was much more, consequential and documented foreign interference in 2016 than anything I think you can accuse Russia of doing. So Israel and the Trump transition colluded basically after Trump was elected to try to undermine Obama's decision at the UN Security Council to let the UN Security Council pass a measure criticizing Israeli settlement building. And Obama, for the first time, decided not to veto that. He abstained. So the Trump transition, at the request of Benjamin Netanyahu, got involved, and they started calling people around at the UN and try to get them to actually block that resolution. That's Israeli interference, I think, in U.S. politics, and there's a long history of that. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu came and gave a speech to Congress trying to kill the Iran nuclear deal. Like the regimes of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar spend a lot of money in Washington trying to influence policies in their favor and have been successful. But those kinds of foreign interference, those suit the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, more or less. So those are the kinds of things that don't get talked about. I personally don't think foreign interference is really the main problem to begin with. And I think certainly the paranoia that was ripped up about Russia was used not out of any genuine concern for foreign interference, but to suit domestic political agendas, to help the Clinton campaign deflect blame for losing to Trump. Instead of doing some self-reflection, they could blame Russian social media ads that nobody saw and that were juvenile and that were barely about the election, or stolen emails. And instead of reckoning with the content of the stolen emails, whoever stole them, whether it was Russia or not, which showed that the party was corrupt and biased against Bernie Sanders, the conversation again became about Russia, and that this is all part of Russia's efforts to destroy our society. So,
do you think
Yeah,
I think that the U.S. intel community has settled on that it was Russia,
yes,
who hacked those emails. Do you believe that it was Russia?
If I had to bet, I would say definitely not, based on all that's come out since. First of all, there's an underlying premise that Glenn Greenwald has talked about tirelessly from the start, which is that we can't just accept U.S. intelligence claims on faith. There needs to be some underlying evidence. I mean, if that wasn't apparent before, it's certainly apparent in the post-Iraq WMD era, right? And the evidence we've got, to me, is not conclusive, and I've written about it extensively. I'm one of the few people who is actually, I think, engaged with what the publicly available evidence says and doesn't say. And what it says, and I've written about this, you can find it at Real Clear Investigations especially, is when Mueller and the FBI and their reports talk about Russian hacking, there's a lot of qualifiers. There's language like Russia appears to have stolen emails during this particular session, or the emails were likely exfiltrated during this session. And those caveats have since been, I think, uh, uh, bolstered by the admissions of key players involved who actually generated the Russian hacking allegation, and that's CrowdStrike. And again, just like Christopher Steele was hired by and paid for by the Clinton campaign, CrowdStrike, which is the firm that generated the Russian hacking allegation, was also hired and paid for by the Clinton campaign. And it was CrowdStrike in June 2016 that first came out publicly and said that Russia had hacked the DNC. And very, I think, suspiciously, just as the FBI relied on Fusion GPS and the Steele Dossier for its FISA warrants on Carter Page and for investigative leads, CrowdStrike also played a really big role in the FBI's investigation of the alleged hack of the DNC. The FBI, as James Comey admitted, never independently investigated the DNC servers. They instead relied on CrowdStrike's forensics. And that to me is just as suspicious a decision as relying on Christopher Steele, because it's like if somebody robbed my apartment and I even accused someone, I said it was my neighbor, because that's what CrowdStrike did. CrowdStrike said it was Russia. That would be like the police relying on my own investigation instead of doing their own investigation. It just doesn't make sense. And since then, we've had some pretty explosive admissions. In December 2017, the CEO of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry, went before the House Intelligence Committee, and he admitted under oath that CrowdStrike has no evidence that these alleged Russian hackers actually exfiltrated anything off of the server. So if you have no evidence that these Russian hackers exfiltrated anything off the server, how can you be so sure in accusing them of stealing the emails? It doesn't make sense. And amazingly, this admission was made in December 2017, but the public only heard about it in May 2020 because that testimony was kept under wraps for more than 2 years. And it only came out a year after the Mueller report shut down. But already before then, I'd already identified in my reporting the major evidentiary gaps that existed. I mean, A, we never saw the underlying intelligence used to blame this on Russia. And B, the intelligence that we did get had caveats. And so that to me is why this case that Russia did it is certainly, it's not proven.
Yeah. So you've obviously read like dossiers and indictments and all sorts of, background information on this. What was it about this story that led you as an investigative journalist to do such a deep dive for so long, to devote so much of your career? There's a lot of stuff to cover, talk about why this story.
Well, I mean, journalistically, I just saw from the start that people were being reckless with the facts, and they're coming out with claims that just seem ridiculous. Like, already in July 2016, there was articles in places like Slate by Franklin Foer that Trump was a Kremlin stooge, and it just escalated and grew and grew and grew. And I saw this pattern where the media was just marching in lockstep with what a very partisan narrative was. But I just didn't, when I would read the articles, there was never any underlying evidence for it. So journalistically, that just seemed to be malpractice to me. And then I looked at the political interest that it was serving, and it was political interest that I personally object to. For it was propping up the Clinton campaign, especially after they lost. And, we later found out that became a deliberate strategy. The book Shattered, which is the first insider account of the Clinton campaign, talks about how right after they lost, they had a meeting and they decided that they were not going to basically accept the election as legitimate and instead blame Russia and Jim Comey. So I see, I'm a leftist, and I was rooting for Bernie Sanders in 2016. And so I was just, unnerved that instead of talking about the contents of the emails that were stolen and talking about the corruption and the bias against Bernie that those emails showed, instead we were talking about how this was part of Russia's plot to destroy our democracy. And especially after the Clintons lost in 2016, that to me was a really opportune time for the Bernie campaign and the Bernie movement to ascend. Because look, I mean, not only had it just been exposed that the Clinton wing was biased against Bernie, but they lost to Trump. They failed. It was humiliating. So it was Bernie's time to take over. And yet the Clinton wing was using this Russia thing to stay around, to protect their own power and privilege. And instead of, overall just a reckoning with the dysfunctions of a system that could produce a president, Donald Trump, where some people in certain states were so upset with the system that had failed them, that they're willing to elect this guy, this reality TV show host who was falsely posing as a working class champion. Instead of reckoning with the dysfunction of that system, everything was being blamed on Russia. And in the process, that was also encouraging this real kind of Cold War chauvinism where it was a good thing now to be antagonistic towards Russia and to basically encourage militarism towards Russia and to worship the national security state as the answer to all of our problems. And so politically, I thought that was a disaster for many reasons. And I also thought, as I explained before, that it would ultimately really help Trump, because what could be a bigger gift to Trump than, instead of an opposition focused on his policies, having a opposition that's focused on a dumb conspiracy theory?
So I guess one question I would have is, you start off, you're a man of the left, you are, but you're criticizing the Clintons, and you're saying things that, ostensibly help Donald Trump. And over the course of months and weeks and years, you may be accruing friends, like strange bedfellows, who are now allies of yours in a sense, and enemies. And there is this weird reordering going on. And, like I had Glenn Greenwald on here a couple weeks ago. I know you're friends with Matt Taibbi. There is people like Matthew Iglesias. There's weird, interesting things happening where, I don't know, a reordering. And everybody talks about like the horseshoe theory of politics. Long wind up to ask, like, do you think you're going to now like go back to being on the left, or are you part of like a new wave of something new that's happening? Like, what's up with this?
Well, I mean, first, look, when you're in journalism, you have to be in a certain way above partisanship, because, again, the facts don't care about which political beliefs I hold. So no matter what the facts are, that's, as a journalist, that's what you have to follow. And when it comes to Russiagate, that's what I did. And no matter who it helps or how it's used, because the facts have to come first. So I can't think of everything in strictly partisan terms. But look, I mean, when you say that what I was saying ostensibly helped Trump, that's true insofar as rejecting a moronic conspiracy theory helps Trump. Now, really, if Trump was actually guilty of conspiring with Russia, then someone like me really would have helped him, because you could say that I was like covering up for the underlying Trump-Russia conspiracy. But there was no Trump-Russia conspiracy. So if there is no underlying Trump-Russia conspiracy, then really I think the people who are helping him are people who are trying to like convince the public that this conspiracy is real. Because ultimately they gave Trump a massive gift, as I talked about. It was a huge gift when the Mueller report came up empty. Trump claimed vindication. His polls went up. So I think they helped Trump, actually, politically. And in terms of the alignment, yeah, look, it's been awkward for me that, like, I even at The Nation magazine, where I did the bulk of my Russiagate work, not everyone there liked it. It was like it was uncomfortable, and it was hard to get the facts out. Very few people were willing to actually do the hard work and look at the facts. And I don't blame like non-journalists for that, because it takes forever to read all these reports and indictments and documents and put something together. It's difficult, but
Is that Comey coming for you?
That was Comey confirmed. So, but journalists whose job it is to look at the facts, it was just ridiculous that people like me and Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, Max Blumenthal, Michael Tracy, that we were like somehow pushed to the margins simply because we refused to go along with a really baseless conspiracy theory. And I'm not responsible for that. I'm not responsible for how people are going to react to, such a major event. And so, in terms of a realignment, it's true that I've had, people who are on the right probably had access to my work in ways that they never did before. I've always been on the left. I worked at Democracy Now! For 10 years. And I always will be on the left, but I just can't. There's some things beyond my control, and politically, my views haven't changed. For as long as I've been politically conscious. So I just what I can control is my own work and what I put out, and that's what I feel like I'm responsible for.
Yeah, that's great. And I can tell you, I mean, the Steele Dossier thing doesn't change anything for me either. Like, it was never the premise of my opposition to Donald Trump. But I do see it's a huge problem if, when you start to say like, but they used that, the FBI used that to go to the FISA court to get warrants to follow, like, it's a big deal. Don't get me wrong. but it was never the premise. Like I never thought like Trump. I like Trump until I heard he peed on those prostitutes. You know what I mean? Like that was never. I didn't never even believe that part of it, but I do think it's a big deal. And I love what you had to say about following the story as a journalist, because I think that's unfortunately kind of becoming an old fashioned value.
Yeah, unfortunately, and that's weird. It should. I like journalism a lot. I really respect it. And part of the problem with Russiagate is that it's really demeaned journalism. It has the Pulitzer Prize was awarded to the New York Times and the Washington Post for their coverage of Russiagate. And if I were them, I'd return it. I'd be embarrassed to have gotten a
Yeah, it's like
Pulitzer for that stuff.
the Reggie Bush type situation with the
Yeah,
Heisman Trophy.
it's humiliating, and everybody drank the Kool-Aid. And there are people who are really genuinely afraid of Trump, and I get that. He was scary, and I especially don't like the people he has around him, the neocons he appointed in his cabinet, and the billionaires, the rapacious billionaires he appointed to pillage the country. I get it, but the answer is not fiction. The answer to reality is being grounded in reality, and people retreated to a fantasy that all this was the result of a Trump-Russia conspiracy. So it's interesting psychologically, and I hope to explore that more in depth one day. But it was a very human.
I'm just a humble like political commentator, but when you do what I do, you have to okay. If I read that like Prince was dead, the artist formerly known as Prince, and then I'm going to go on TV or something and talk about like, wow, like he was a great, not only a great singer, but a great guitarist. But I'm operating off the premise, like, do I have to like now independently verify that Prince is dead? Like if the AP tells me, if Reuters tells me, if Jonathan Chait tells me, I'm going to believe that he's dead. And like at some point when it's the intel community and top journalistic outlets and highly respected individuals telling you something, how much of this do I need to like do my own research, as they say?
Yeah, and what's amazing is they're in such a bubble that there's despite a little bit of a reckoning now about Steele, there's just not the reckoning that's needed. When Iraq WMDs collapsed, they found a scapegoat, Judy Miller. That's how they handled that, basically. And now they're going to basically say that, okay, fine, the Steele Dossier was a fiction, but really they're probably going to find a way to blame that on Russia, because Russiagators are going to Russiagate. So that was really all somehow Russia's fault, because Danchenko is Russian. So the narrative is going to be, and Adam Schiff, I think, has hinted at this. So like Danchenko, this Russian, he fooled noble Christopher Steele, who was just trying to find that he took advantage of our noble British hero. I think that's going to be actually more of a dominant excuse. And yeah, there'll be no accountability. But Glenn Greenwald makes this point a lot. They don't realize how much contempt Russiagate has engendered, and how people just don't trust the media like they used to. I mean, already trust in media was pretty low, but Russiagate made it way worse. And the people who exist in these media bubbles just haven't reckoned with that, because there's no consequence for that. I mean,
I have to be honest with you, man. I watch these TV channels, and as a Christian, I try not to like judge people. I try not to like have bitterness or hatred in my heart, but I watch some of these people on TV, and I have to really work at not seriously disliking them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, before I let you go, some of the people you've mentioned, including yourself, you're on YouTube. You have like a very popular YouTube channel. You get hundreds of thousands of views in some cases. And, I think my biggest podcast so far, well, Jen Psaki's number one, but I think Glenn Greenwald is number two. And it seems like a lot of the people like in your space, the Matt Taibes of the world, are really big on YouTube. And I'm wondering why you think that is.
Well, I mean, maybe we should give tribute to the YouTube people for creating a great platform. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people certainly are looking for alternatives to the corporate media. That's very, very clear. That's very, very clear. And it's an exciting time. I've always believed in independent media, because I'm a big Noam Chomsky fan. So manufacturing consent had a big impact on me. And it's just my experience that it's very hard to get the truth out of corporate media. And so anytime there's an alternative, that's what I gravitate to. And I guess that's what a lot of people are doing now.
Yeah.
My friend Jimmy Dore is a comedian, has a huge show, really popular, and he reaches a really interesting audience as leftists, but also people on the right and people who don't really identify with anything. And that's just people have been lied to enough, and people have
Yeah.
witnessed the sort of elite media entitlement enough and the snobbery and the condescension that they're looking to other places.
Yeah. My brother-in-law is a huge Jimmy Dore fan. Um, so, yeah, I just was hanging with him and he was telling me, talking him up. Um, this is a problem though. Like if I can't trust the government and I can't trust the mainstream media, then it opens me up. Okay, so it is great for people like you who you're able to provide alternative information outside the corporate media, and it sounds like you're a very trusted, responsible source. But like, doesn't it open it up for QAnon and crazy conspiracy theories? If it's almost like a cultural relativism, I worry about that.
It does, but as opposed to who? As opposed to maybe Blue Anon, which is the Rachel Maddows of the world, who tell us that there is a sprawling Trump-Russia conspiracy, who tell us that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation, and that's why we can't even share an article on social media about it. I mean, Glenn Greenwald makes this point a lot, that basically the biggest purveyors of misinformation over the last several years have been the people screaming the loudest about misinformation. And yeah, QAnon is certainly a threat, but I'm more concerned with the more mainstream threats, the ones that tell millions of Americans that Russia is invading our democracy with dumb social media ads, and that Trump is a Russian agent, and everything possible that we don't like about our country is the fault of Russia or whatever other foreign boogeyman there is of the way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm concerned about. So, I mean, look, unfortunately, either you believe in free speech or you don't, and we have to. I don't believe that Rachel Maddow should be censored. She has the right to tell people that Trump is a Russian asshat, and she has the right to tell people in North Dakota that they're going to freeze to death because Russia's going to cut off their power. I don't know if you saw that clip. It's hilarious. But she has the right to do that. And if she has the right to do that, then everybody else has the right to do that. That's how I see it.
All right. Well, this has been really good, man. I really appreciate you doing it. How could people who want to follow you on Twitter and check out your YouTube channel, how could they do that? And your writing.
For my YouTube show called Pushback, go to thegrayzone.com. Twitter, I'm Aaron J. Maté, M-A-T-E. And my Substack is mate.substack.com, M-A-T-E.substack.com.
All right, Aaron Maté. Thank you. Aaron Maté, pronounced correctly. It's Luis, but no one gets my last name right either. Aaron Maté, thank you for coming on the news.
Thanks for having me.